It's a really special treat for me to introduce Brad Roberts from Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Brad is a major figure on issues of nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, strategic stability, extended deterrence. His book is assigned reading in this class. We're going to hear from him today about theories of victory, both red and blue. A little bit of background. Brad to Stanford grad.
Or a blue shirt.
And then graduate work abroad in Europe. And then he held several major posts in Washington. He was in the Congressional Research Service at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a think tank in Washington. And then at the Institute for Defense Analysis, which reports to the Joint Chiefs. At the start of the Obama administration, he joined the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear weapons and missile defense policy. And we worked closely together there. And Brad became a key figure in both the Ballistic Missile Defense Review and the Nuclear Posture Review, and the key implementer of the Nuclear Posture Review with our allies. He left at the end of the first Obama term and went to Japan for a number of weeks, where he was with the major think tank of the Defense Ministry, getting more insight into Japanese thinking on these matters. And then he returned to the States and went back to Stanford to CSAT, Center for International Security and Cooperation, where he was in residence to write this book. As he was finishing writing the book, he was recruited by Lawrence Livermore to direct the Center for Global Security Research, which has become a major center under his leadership for research and publications, fantastic seminars, collective works of all kinds on a whole range of security issues, a lot of which I think people are not home. So please give a nice warm welcome to Brad Roberts.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. I don't have PowerPoint slides. I guess that's against the law pretty much these days, but there you go. And rather than start with the red and blue theory of victory argument, which if you read the book, you'll know the gist of. But I want to start in a different point to set a slightly different context. And that is that, and just to be clear, it's my understanding, we're recording the talk, but not the Q&A that follow. And remind me, what time should I aim for on ending line?
You can aim around 3-ish, so just till 3:30 for the Q&A.
Good. Thanks. So my point of departure is the latest effort to ban the bomb. Who couldn't be in favor? Well, I'm not. It's made me very unpopular. And I published an essay with the European Leadership Network last, Thursday, a week ago now, which you can find at their website, and under the title, Ban the Bomb or Bomb the Ban. This is a germane topic because there is a ban now on the books called the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This was negotiated at the United Nations in the General Assembly last summer. No nuclear weapon state participated in the negotiation. No allied nuclear weapon state participated. But the treaty was concluded and open for signature. And the way treaty law works, the treaty enters into force when a certain threshold is met as spelled out in the treaty. In the case of, for example, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the negotiators of the treaty said basically every country that might be capable of setting off a nuclear explosion would have to be a state party before the treaty could enter into force. Very high threshold. Some treaties set very low thresholds. And I don't remember exactly the number required, but it's something like 70, and there are 100-some signatories of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. but not very many rushing to ratify the treaty. And to be clear about treaty law, treaty ratification means, so the executive branch gets to go negotiate and sign treaties, but the legislative branch, our Congress or a parliament in another country, has to express its consent to the entry into force of the treaty, and then the executive sends a letter to the parliament. Off you go. This is the process that's now underway on this ban treaty, where capitals are now deciding this thing that our disarmament ambassador signed us up for is a good thing. Should we ratify it or not? On the one hand, for most countries, it's just kind of a protest vote, with the slow pace of nuclear disarmament since the end of the Cold War and the extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995. And for them, it doesn't really involve very many equities. But for countries under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, I understand you have a project on South Korea and Japan. This project presents some complexities, and of course, even more so for the nuclear weapon states. So as these capitals are now debating, do I sign up, do I ratify it, do I want the treaty to become international law, actually? The main political activity in support of the treaty is activity by the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. And ICAN won the Nobel Peace Prize last autumn. You may have seen that. And ICAN's leader, Beatrice Finn, says that the function of the campaign, now that the treaty has been negotiated, is to have a campaign of pressure and shame on states that haven't signed up. And so I'm trying to stand back from this political process and comment, because of course there's a tremendous pressure on the countries that are debating ratification. The analogy that the advocates of the ban have in mind is the Ottawa Convention on Landmines. And mostly you're too young to remember the post-Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and the situation that followed, which was roughly a decade of misery for the Afghan people as they stumbled literally across the landmines that were left on the ground. And then similarly, the wars of the 90s produced some of the same results. And the humanitarian groups that were stuck with the job of patching up to the victims of this came together and said, why can't we stop this? Why can't we just be rid of landmines? And the possessors of landmines said, well, we think for a pretty good reason you can't be rid of them. And they said, we don't care. And the NGOs that were doing care and taking of victims of landmines joined up with a bunch of countries that didn't have landmines in their military arsenals, created the Ottawa Convention to ban landmines, and then took 15 years to pressure other countries, including the United States, and 2000, I think it was 14, the United States finally signed on to the Landmine Convention. So this is the analogy that they have in mind. I think it's a bad idea at the wrong time. And the things that it seems to me that it's important for people in these national capitals to understand as they consider ratification are one, this is called a ban. It's in fact a commitment to negotiate a ban. When it comes to how do you deal with the two main problems that we would encounter if the treaty entered into force, there's no answer. What are the two main problems? Well, persuading nuclear-armed states and their allies that on the pathway from here to zero, there's some substitute for the benefit we think there might be to having nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And then secondly, at zero, there's going to be some mechanism that keeps 12 states from cheating. Meaning the ability to detect, to verify compliance, to detect non-compliance in a timely manner, and to come together a sheriff and a posse or some such to bring the non-compliant state back into behavior. What are these problems have been clear since the failure of the Baruch Plan in 1946, the first disarmament plan, nuclear disarmament plan. What are the details in this treaty about solving that problem? Quote, to be negotiated with the future competent authority. Sounds great. Why don't I sign up for that? Second main thing I think it's important for people to know is that to expect and understand the lopsided impact of the pressure and shaming campaign. The ICANN network, 468 member organizations. Where are they? How many are in Pyongyang? 0. How many are in Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea? 9. So that leaves approximately 460 in the countries that are either without nuclear weapons, or 200 of those organizations are in the democracies, and almost half of them are in France and Norway. So do we really believe that the pressure campaign is going to work to get Kim Jong-un to sign up for a nuclear ban? On the ICANN website, you can download a letter to sign to your parliamentarian. How's that going to work in Moscow? But it's going to work in countries in Western Europe who are weakly committed to NATO's nuclear deterrence posture, weakly committed to the cost of modernizing NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, and where nuclear weapons are often very unpopular. So there's an asymmetric impact that people should understand about this. The third thing to understand is that if it actually enters into force with U.S. allies participating, it will end extended deterrence. As I argued that the ban is vague on how to go from here to 0 and live at 0, it's very specific on all of the forms of cooperation that would be banned between states parties to the treaty and nuclear-armed allies. And that list of things that's banned is identical to the list of things that NATO allies do for nuclear deterrence. So the net effect of entry into force of this treaty, it seems to me, the one main effect is it going to be on Russia, North Korea, China. It's going to be to end extended deterrence as we know it. Think about that in terms of the research project you have on North Korea, on South Korea, Japan. So if it's not really a ban, but it's a plan to have a ban in the future, what is it? Well, the advocates of the campaigners, as they self-describe themselves, say that this is really fundamentally about re-energizing the nuclear disarmament, which has been demoralized by the lack of progress in recent years. And it's about re-educating people like me who believe in nuclear deterrence with the eye to delegitimize nuclear weapons so that over time we'll invest less and they'll just kind of lose their legitimacy and actually getting rid of, we don't need to worry about life at 0 because there won't be any cheating because these will be illegitimate weapons. And so what is this re-education campaign they have in mind? Well, they make a number of claims about this, and I will highlight 4. The first is the claim that nuclear deterrence doesn't work. And they put as a straw man the opposite argument that it always works. And I think this is a whitewash. The best study I've seen on this topic was I cite in the paper from the Finnish Peace Research Institute, 1996, a fine little edited book on nuclear weapons and history. And the concluding chapter says, did nuclear deterrence work? Does nuclear deterrence work? The jury's still out. There's a massive contradictory evidence. And if if you read ICANN's materials, the jury's in, and it's very clear nuclear deterrence does not work. I think there's abundant evidence that it works sometimes well and sometimes poorly and other times not at all. Second claim they make an obvious, legitimate argument about the morality of nuclear weapons, that if ever they were employed, this would be a humanitarian catastrophe unknown in human history so far, not even in 1945. And then they claim the moral high ground and say that finishes the discussion. Particularly if you say nuclear deterrence doesn't exist, then you don't have to assess the moral benefit, the moral consequences. I take the view that nuclear weapons helped end World War II in a circumstance short of what would have been a much more massive disaster for people of Japan and also for the people of the United States. That's a moral consequence that deserves some discussion. And so I think they do get credit for having a moral high ground, but not the moral high ground. There are many moral high grounds in this discussion. Third topic, they make the argument, they make the claim that the treaty will strengthen international law. Well, it might over time, that's possible. There's no discussion of the possibility that it might weaken and debase international law. And here I think it's useful to have in mind, we Americans have the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, a law that went one step too far. We weren't ready to ban alcohol. And there was a lot of lawless behavior that followed, and the law was undone because it didn't align with our sense of what was just, right, in the circumstance. Another example, the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, a treaty by which then all of the democracies of the world agreed to renounce war as an instrument of policy. That's the title of the treaty. And not just the democracies, also Japan, which went to war 1 week after signing the treaty. Germany, which went to war a couple of years after signing the treaty. I mean, you take my point. Didn't contribute to a strengthening of international law. It accelerated the contempt for international law that formed in Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, and also Moscow at the time. And I think the last claim I would make in the last item I would flag in their list of claims in their re-education campaign is that they speak for the people. Beatrice Finn, the ICANN chair, is very clear on this, that ICANN, 468 member organizations, speaks for the human community against people stuck in an old, out-of-date, bad paradigm. Well, remember, this essay is sort of crafted for the parliamentarian who's trying to decide whether or not to vote for it. I would think they'd take offense at that. Don't our elected officials speak for us? And when we're asked in a public opinion poll what we think, we're capable of reflecting our own views. And on nuclear weapons, we are inherently fickle. And here, so we're working on a South Korea case study. The South Korean and American governments very closely monitor thinking in the body politic in South Korea about these topics, and there's an annual polling thing we do. I follow this very closely, and the data is very clear in a variety of ways, including its murkiness and contradictory character. How interested are the South Korean people in the North Korean nuclear threat? Well, of course, steady increase over a couple of decades. How interested are South Korean people in having an effective nuclear deterrent against this threat? Well, also rising. Does this make you interested in the South Korean nuclear capability? Yes, on roughly the same scale. Do you have confidence in the United States as a guarantor of South Korea? Yes, also on the same scale. Do you believe that the United States would employ nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea if it had to? Yes, on the same scale. So here are a group of very attentive people. They care about these issues saying contradictory things about nuclear weapons. ICANN would tell you they speak for the people, and I think we shouldn't let NGOs claim to speak when we have a political process that allows us to speak. NGOs play a very important role, a very valuable role, but they are not elected. They're not accountable to the people, they're accountable to their funders. They have agendas, that's their value. But that's different from having political legitimacy. So I think a yes vote for the ban isn't in the interest of most of the world. And unfortunately, most of the people who care about this issue care principally about disarmament. So it's a hot topic. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the United States, but it will. A quick question.
Is there any evidence of Russia or China's funding for the movement during that disproportionate investigation?
I don't know, and I can't find anybody who cares about posing or answering that question. You would think for a Russian leader so interested in information warfare and stirring the pot in our political system and all, that he'd see huge opportunity here. On the other hand, the opportunity, I mean, the divisions are occurring without him necessarily. The core of that argument is then the ban's the wrong fix to this problem at this time. But it doesn't really tell you why nuclear weapons are still important for us to have. Why we can't just run the risk of unilateral disarmament. What are they good for in our strategy? And this is the question, one of the questions I try to answer in the book. And we say our declaratory policy, now our national declaratory policy, repeated word for word from the Obama NPR to the Trump NPR, is that we, the United States, reserve the right to employ nuclear weapons when, in the extreme circumstances, when our vital interests or those of an ally are in jeopardy. Well, what's the circumstance that can get us there? What's the real world circumstance that could bring us to a vital interest being in jeopardy? And aside from the occasional wild cards that we can't predict, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. We face 3 nuclear-armed adversaries who have expressed a strong commitment to undo the regional orders in which they sit, and we're there to help them. China was really the first to get seized with this question. China watched the end of the Cold War, celebrated with the rest of us, watched the Persian Gulf War with alarm, because the Chinese military was roughly in scale and scope and quality like the Iraqi military, and 4 days later it was gone. And then they watched the Taiwan Missile Strait crisis of 1995 report. And any American who recalls that crisis will remember that we dispatched a carrier battle group. Any Chinese scholar who remembers that event will remember that we dispatched a second carrier battle. The first they understood to be show the flag. The second they understood to be America's ready for war with us. And we better be ready for war with America. And at the time, the Chinese national security strategy was emphasizing 4 modernizations: social, political, economic, and military. And military modernization was important for. And they had no means to put against this new problem. So they put their heads against the problem. They got their intellectual house in order. And they wrote a lot in the 90s and 2000s on the topic of the challenge of deterring and defeating, these are their words, deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. Each of those words has an important implication for the answer they came to. Deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. And the Russian military followed suit by a short period of time. It was the war in Kosovo. Here was NATO bombing a former Soviet ally. And moreover, we were doing it with exactly the means that the Russian military, the Soviet military had aspired to, long-range reconnaissance strike complexes, they were called, the ability to project power decisively without putting any boots on the ground. This was really alarming. So what did the Russian military focus on? Deterring and defeating the conventionally superior nuclear armed major power and its allies. The North Koreans appear to have come along a little later. In roughly the mid-2000s, we have press reports that they used cyber means to gain access to the war plans for the defense of South Korea, and discovered that in those war plans there was an option for regime removal of North Korea. And what had been with it, the nuclear and missile program, a program of build, borrow, pause, build, borrow, pause, became a program of build, 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 build. And now we're seeing if they're back at the point where they want to pause. And they set out, they, the North Koreans, set out in writing fewer of the ideas, and they don't use that little catechism, blah, 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 but it's the same basic set of ideas. And the fact that these three countries face a common problem, us, we shouldn't then be surprised that they've sort of come to a common set of answers to their problem. And those are roughly, if war with America appears inevitable, go first. Create a fait accompli on the ground at the conventional level of war, and present the United States and its allies with a picture of the terrible price to be paid to reverse it. So if war over Taiwan appears inevitable, grab Taiwan. If North Korea thinks war looks inevitable, grab Seoul and then sue for peace. But what if we don't sue for peace? What if we're not willing? What if we're willing to run the costs of trying to reverse the fait accompli? Well, the second main concept in the strategy is to separate the United States from its allies and our allies from each other. You've all read Kim Jong-un's statements about if he ever has to employ nuclear weapons, his very first target, Japan, Tokyo, you're in my nuclear process. He says it over and over again. We tend to think of that as, well, that's a sign of the bad blood of these data, which misses the strategic point altogether. The strategic point is the conventional defense of the South Korea requires not just the South Korean military and the American forces on the peninsula, but the support of military forces sitting at bases in Japan, flying the United Nations flag. The defense of South Korea is still the business of the United Nations. And the dispatch of those people and the military hardware from the territory of Japan requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. And in the 1950s, this was a no-brainer because there was no risk. And Kim Jong-un was trying to make it a brainer. He's trying to concentrate the thinking of the Japanese leadership to say, do you really have a dog in this fight sufficient to run the risk of my nuclear attack? And are you really willing to die in hundreds of thousands for a country that's not your ally? You can make similar arguments for the Chinese and the Russians. But let's say that doesn't work. And the US and some allies still come to try to reverse the fait accompli. Then what? Well, in shorthand, we've adopted as A2AD, anti-access area denial. But essentially, you delay the arrival of American power projection forces. You defeat them where you can. And you try and break the will of US allies to support the power projection effort. But let's say we're still coming. Well, then you remind America that the American homeland is at risk. Maybe by nuclear means, maybe by missile means that are non-nuclear, maybe by cruise missiles from submarines, maybe by cyber attack, maybe by taking down commercially critical space systems. But you remind America that the homeland is home. And because that's 4 concepts in 3 different countries and it's all elaborate, I tried to look for a shorthand. And in the 1970s, there was a debate about Soviet nuclear modernization. And we had a Secretary of Defense at the time, Harold Brown, who said, how do we understand this? We build, they build. We stop, they build. What explains what the Soviet Union was doing? Was it just a machine that was used to cranking out nuclear sausage, and it was just going to keep doing that? Or did they actually have some theory of victory, that they could fight and win a big nuclear war? Or did they have a theory of victory for war in Europe that would not go nuclear, but they could win? And wouldn't go nuclear because nuclear deterrence would work. And if they had a theory of victory, should we have a theory of victory? And this debate went on through the Cold War. The Cold War ended and the debate went away. Well, I think these 3 countries have theories of victory in 2 senses. Clausewitz's view of war, as you should know, is that it's a continuation of politics by other means. So if you're defining victory, victory is not, in Clausewitz's view, when you vanquish your enemy in battle. Victory is a political thing. It's when you bring your enemy to a, quote, culminating point where the enemy chooses to no longer run the costs and risks. I think that's a pretty accurate summary of how these 3 countries think about an escalating conflict with the United States and our allies. They believe that they can bring us to a culminating point, preferably lower on that escalation ladder, but maybe higher. And we're sort of perplexed about this because, after all, we're the strongest power by definition in this problem construct. And so I've tried to pay attention to how is it that they explain to themselves that their threats to escalate are going to be more credible in our eyes than our threats to escalate are going to be in our eyes. How do they explain that to themselves? And you tend to hear 3 arguments. 1, asymmetry of geography. We can't defend Taiwan against a major mainland attack without attacking the mainland. We've attacked the Chinese homeland. Their threat to attack the American homeland ought to look pretty credible to us. Secondly, asymmetry of stake. And the best way to make this point is with a short story from Major General Yao Yunju, a very engaging, funny, thoughtful woman with a PhD. Her PhD is on the topic of comparing Chinese and Western traditions of thinking about deterrence. And we have often debated these questions of escalation dynamics and would the burden of escalation in a China-US confrontation fall on China or the United States? And in a recent interaction, she said, okay, so let me summarize, Brad, what I think your argument. That you Americans, in a war that goes badly over Taiwan, where you're losing, what would you have at stake? Your commitment to the government on Taiwan and to the people of Taiwan. You're standing in the views of your East Asian allies. You're standing in the eyes of your allies globally. Europe's going to be watching. Putin's going to be watching. And she said, and you Americans always think to stand for the right thing in the world. So your sense of moral purpose will be one of your stakes. And she said, well, and what will we have? And she said, these are all, okay, she said, I take it. These are important stakes. Now, what would China have at stake? She said, only 2 things. This would be a war about finally recovering our sovereignty after a century-long effort to recover from the century of humiliation. You know, China carved up, occupied by major powers. And secondly, frankly, if we lose, the grip of the Communist Party and Beijing is a little up for grabs. Whose interests, she asks, are more vital? Yours are important, ours are vital, you will back that. You may have superior power, you will back that. That's the point about asymmetry of state. This is also Putin's view. Third argument here is, well, they're tough guys and we'll win. They're tough guys. These are people in Putin, Kim Jong-un, and Xi Jinping who've risen to the top of a very messy, brutal political system, often through, I mean, at least two of those men kill in order to stay in power. And they run tough authoritarian states. And they look at us and say, you know, well, you're risk averse, you're always divided, you're not led by your best people. And so long as we don't really do a grievous insult to your interests, punch you in your nose, you'll run home. So 3 different explanations whereby they convince themselves that they can threaten to escalate and actually escalate in the conflict. And it will bring us to the culminating point where we choose to no longer accept the costs and risks of continued war. And if you don't believe me, just read all that stuff, because they've written all of this down. It's in their interest to write it all down. It's in their interest to convince us that they had solved all these problems. But I said a theory of victory in the spirit of Clausewitz, I think more importantly is Sun Tzu. To me, it's not clear that Putin, Xi Jinping, or Kim Jong-un want to go to war against the United States and our allies. What they'd much rather do is, as Sun Tzu would have argued, subdue us without fighting. The essence of Yao Yunzhu's analysis of the distinction between Western and Chinese traditions of thinking about deterrence is the following. She said, think of a timeline. Your Western concept of deterrence is at the point on the timeline where the intention to act has already been formed, and you are pressuring an actor not to act on the intention by threat, cost, and risk. So you've got a strategy of coercion and compellence, and a little assurance, because you have to tell them, well, if they're good, they won't get in more trouble. We Chinese think back here, she said. It's about, if we're stuck dealing with the intention, we fail to prevent the formation of the intention to challenge our interests. So there was a failure. We want to be successful back here. And it's not a strategy of coercion, it's the art of the strategy. It's her phrase. But it's not just her phrase, the art of the stratagem. Stratagem being a strategy that involves elements of both truth and untruth, aimed at shaping the decisions of your potential adversary. Sun Tzu, subdue your enemy without fighting. Kim Jong-un, break America's hostile ways. These are all phrases hopefully recognized. So, I think we have 3 countries who've done their homework on the problem in front of them and have put together a bunch of ideas and some theories and some hypotheses, and now also the capabilities and the operational doctrine and the exercises and the like, and they're trying to bring home to us their confidence that they've got the right. That's the red theory of victory shtick. So what's our answer? Frankly, we weren't even thinking about this problem for a long time. Our focus of military innovation in this country on 9/11 when zeroed in on a new problem, and that's where we put our focus for a long time. The problem of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. We put a whole lot of blood and treasure and intellectual capital onto that problem. So remember, they've been at work on this problem since the 1990s. The first order answer I tend to hear from the American milk expert community is, isn't the answer inherent in the formulation of the problem? Meaning if their problem is that they face a conventionally superior nuclear and major power and its allies isn't the answer that we're the conventional superior nuclear armed major power with all its allies. And we should just tell them, you choose your level of escalation, we can trump you. Doesn't matter where you go. And you cross the nuclear threshold, we'll turn you into a glass parking lot, don't need to think about it anymore. That's not much of a theory, Victor. That's a theory from a foreign policy perspective of the capacity. The result of a war in which we engage in last resort employment of nuclear weapons to save ourselves or an ally, when we might have been effective in preventing getting to that point, would teach a lesson about us that wouldn't be helpful for the people that would follow. The next answer I tend to hear is that, well, this is like a Cold War problem, and we need Cold War solutions, like in Europe. If the Russian theory of victory includes this escalate to de-escalate thing with a, quote, nuclear scalpel for every problem in Europe, which is the Russian military claim, then the answer is, well, we should have that too. Work in the Cold War, it ought to strike me as that's tit for tat strategy making. We need a strategy that counters their strategy, not their capabilities. I like, again, a Yao Yunzhu phrase is, when asked to describe what's China's nuclear strategy, well, it's counter-deterrence. To us, that sounds a little odd. What's counter-deterrence? She said, well, you Americans have a deterrence strategy. The objective of which, from a Chinese perspective, is to prevent us from doing the right thing when the time comes. And so we don't want to engage in an arms race. We're not trying to build up a nuclear force equivalent to yours. We're just going to make sure that if you try and employ your deterrence strategy against us and employ your nuclear weapon against us, we'll keep shooting until you stop. Your choice. So they're trying to counter our strategy as opposed to our capabilities. And what does that mean for us? And the Obama administration gave something of an answer to this question. We said that what we wanted to do was, and this was in the NPR Missile Defense Review and the Quadrennial Defense Review 2009, was to comprehensively strengthen regional deterrence architecture and adapt them to new problems. Comprehensively strengthen, meaning not just rely on nuclear weapons to deter North Korean nuclear attack, but to have some missile defense, to have some non-nuclear strike capability, to be resilient in cyberspace and outer space where they might try to attack us, and to ensure that we had a conventional balance of forces, general purpose forces, that made a fait accompli look problematic. And we thought that comprehensively employing all these tools could strip away their confidence that they could calibrate their confidence in their escalation strategy. And of course, if you're readers of the Trump administration strategic documents, you'll see they've gone a few steps further. First of all, they've put more of the emphasis on what I would call the Sun Tzu side of the problem, meaning they've talked much more about strategic competition as the long-term problem. If strategic competition is your long-term problem, deterrence isn't necessarily the solution. Deterrence is a part of the solution. But long-term competition is about more than just preventing your potential adversary from doing something. It's about winning something somehow over time. And there, I think we can't credit with the Trump administration of having put down a great deal of new thought in that area. And I think we've in general, put too much of our emphasis in thinking about our theories of victory on the military side of the discussion, on the nuclear side of the discussion, instead of in the sort of broader political orders that we stand for in Northeast Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. So the closing argument I would make would like to make is then what does this tell us about the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy? Well, nothing like what it was in the Cold War. Every discussion of U.S. military strategy, U.S. diplomatic strategy, U.S. foreign policy had a nuclear component to it. Today, we see nuclear weapons as having a relatively, in comparison to the past, much narrower role in our strategy. But it's a so far unique and irreplaceable role that attaches to the single problem of when vital interests are at risk. And if we're successful and effective with deterrence, our vital interests will never be put at risk, nor will those of an ally. So we'll never actually see directly or have firsthand experience of the impact of nuclear weapons on this problem. It can only ever be inferred and assumed. The only time we'll know something definitive about deterrence is if it fails. So I would say there's a very narrow and so far irreplaceable role for nuclear weapons, but it is on this unique thing called our most vital interests. And this goes back to the beginning. We could say that nuclear deterrence is unreliable, say that strengthening international norms could improve our security situation, step away from and perhaps unilaterally remove our nuclear weapons. And what we'd be doing is putting ourselves in a position where when our most vital interests might ever be put at risk, we would have taken away the main tool for defending those interests and disincentivizing that challenge. And particularly if we do that unilaterally, we're left in a situation where our adversaries have that tool and we and our allies don't, which seems to be, history's taught us a few things, and one is that's not a great position to be in. So with that, I want to leave you thinking about the ban treaty and without raising any questions about the motives or ethics of people who support the ban, to say I question their judgment. And that bombing the ban is a silly shorthand to attract the reader's attention. But we don't live in a world where that kind of process is going to be effective in creating the conditions that will allow us to move away from reliance on weapons to the extent we rely on them. And so a thought about the ban, a thought about theories of victory. These three potential adversaries, and maybe a fourth in Iran, who have thought very hard about how to push back on a world order to which they just fundamentally object, and our role in it, and the use of nuclear weapons, both in that pushback and also safeguarding themselves if we push back too hard in response. And leaving you with this question of, well, what is our blue theory of victory? What does it mean to not only protect ourselves in this world, but ensure that we're able to use our power and the power of our allies, and not just our military tools, but our political and social and economic tools to safeguard a world order that's been in our interest for a long time. So with those closing thoughts, let me open it up for Q&A and commentary and comments masquerading as questions.